Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris took part in a town hall-style event on CNN from Pennsylvania last night.
Do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
You heard it there. Harris said she agreed with former four-star General John Kelly that her Republican opponent, Donald Trump, is a fascist. During the town hall, Harris hammered Trump, labeling him unstable and unfit to serve. But critics say she avoided specifics on her policy plans and sidestepped some difficult questions. Joining me to discuss this and more, Alex Gangitano, White House correspondent here at The Hill. So this was a pretty wide-ranging conversation. She took questions from the audience. They covered a lot of topics. But my takeaway is that she's really kind of leaning into the anti-Trump message in her closing pitch to voters. What did you take away from it?
That's right. It definitely feels like that whenever a question came up that she had the opportunity to maybe talk about a policy plan or talk about something about herself personally, she always reverted back to Trump. It did feel a lot like her stump speech. You know, I watch her rallies, and what we saw during her town hall was her trying to get back the talking points that she mentions when she's at her rallies talking to supporters, whereas this was talking to undecided voters who wanted to, I think, know more about her plans and what makes her different than Trump, versus what they got from her was a lot of her just finding a way to criticize him in any way that he could. I mean, the news of her agreeing that he's a fascist, that was newsy. Besides that, it was a lot of the same criticism we've heard before.
There's been this criticism of the media that Harris is being graded unfairly here, that Trump often weaves his terminology when asked tough questions, goes off on tangent, doesn't make sense with some of his answers. But it seems to me that Harris doesn't really have concise, easy to understand answers to some of these more difficult questions. What mistakes did she make during her vice presidency? Whether she or Trump would be a better friend to Israel. These are difficult questions and hard to navigate. Sometimes you have to reflect on mistakes you've made in the past, but you know, word salad is the use that gets tossed around when she's faced with some of those pretty difficult questions.
That's right. We heard from a lot of Democrats in the past hours since the town hall that have said that this was word salad. She can't have this concise, here's one thing I would do differently, or here's one thing that I think that I have had a weak moment on in my career. Those were all questions that, it opened her up to being able to talk on a personal level with voters, but she instead had these long-winded answers that somehow found their way back to Trump.
We talked about John Kelly, who labeled Trump a fascist, or said that he exhibits at least some of those tendencies. Trump responded on Truth Social in the usual Trump way, called him a lowlife, called him a total degenerate. Kelly is not the first former Trump official to issue a warning like this. Many of them are Republicans. How would you say the Trump campaign is trying to combat what we're getting from some of these former Trump officials?
Yeah, so John Kelly, as you mentioned, is just the latest to come out with his criticism. He just this week, 2 interviews, New York Times, The Atlantic, back-to-back, and him deciding 2 weeks before the campaign to come out and call him a fascist or talk about how he wanted his military to look like Hitler's. I think that the Trump campaign is just going to highlight just that. He chose to do this 2 weeks before the campaign. It's a performative move. He had the opportunity to speak up many other times, and John Kelly has. But in order to do this, many of them have. Every time, though, that somebody has, the Trump campaign comes back and says, some criticism of they were a lowlife or they couldn't handle, the Trump agenda. And so they have an answer for all of these, which isn't usually them defending Trump on these issues, but more so just criticizing the person who's coming out with them. And so far, we'll see if a criticism like somebody like John Kelly or even these other former officials who we do keep hearing from, if that will move the needle, or if the people that they would have impacted have already decided years ago that they're not going to support Trump again, maybe in 2020 decided, and it's not moving the needle with people in 2024.
Here in these final 2 weeks of the race, the Harris campaign thinks they have an advantage over Trump when it comes to the get out the vote efforts in these states. On the ground, how does that look? How is that advantage possibly playing out in favor of the Harris campaign?
Yeah, they definitely have the financial advantage. She's raising money like threefold over Trump. They have the organizing advantage. They have the office advantage in these battleground states and just the sheer infrastructure in those states. But at the end of the day, it's who comes out to vote. As much as when I talk to them and they say, our operation is just so much exceeds his. But, how will voters actually turn out in these states like North Carolina that, yeah, you do have more volunteers and door knockers and people making phone calls. But is your message really resonating? with these voters when they do hear from people in your campaign. They do see all these volunteers and signs and ads inundating them in their state, but is your message really breaking through?
Early voting is also already underway across the country. More than 28 million ballots have already been cast, according to the University of Florida's election lab. Everyone is parsing through these numbers to try to determine what they mean for the race. Republicans are outperforming what they did in 2020. Some of that is to be expected because of the shift in messaging from the Republican Party to urge people to use mail-in and early voting. Are you taking anything away? Do you think we can read anything into these early voting numbers to what it means for the campaigns?
Yeah, early voting's a tough, thing. As you mentioned, in 2020, it wasn't as popular with the Republicans, and now it more so is. And of course, we dealt last time with COVID and people not feeling comfortable physically going to the polls. So maybe some Democrats were more likely to turn to early voting or mail-in ballots than Republicans were. I do think the initial thought with early voting last week when we were seeing a big uptick in a state like Georgia was that young people who are in a very reliable voting bloc on election day, them early voting and taking advantage, especially in these towns with college campuses, in these swing states, that is typically good news for Democrats because they might not show up on election day. But we have seen early voting look like it's good news for Republicans too, because in a lot of these critical states, just the sheer number of people coming out could be good news if Trump is breaking ground with some of these people.
Nevada's been one of those states where
right.
journalists out there have been saying Republicans, especially in rural areas, are showing up in big numbers. Americans say they're ready to accept the results of the election, even if their candidate loses. 77% said they will accept that loss, even if their candidate doesn't win. But they also expect violence. 62% say they expect that after the election. That's not a good thing. This is all according to a new Scripps News Ipsos poll. What measures are being taken across the country to try to make sure there is not chaos in the days after the election?
Yeah, it's interesting. The White House has been asked this question, of course, with President Biden not on the ballot, but President Biden has said that, there are concerns over what could happen, especially if Trump were to lose. Could we have a repeat of the days after or before certification of the ballot in 2020? I think that the government has obviously been looking at this. We know that the White House has been paying attention to this. The Harris campaign also is preparing for, if she were to win, what kind of court challenges they would face, what could come from the Biden campaign. And Trump himself has been questioned on, do you want this kind of chaos after Election Day? And I think he has, done a combination of spreading a message of peace, but also, stirring up some people who could be angry with the results. So I think right now we're in this waiting period of seeing if the measures are in place to prevent what we did see on January 6th.
I run by the White House at night, and it seems like every time I go by there, the barrier is further and further away from it to protect the White House in these last few weeks here. Let's talk about the Senate race in Nebraska. National Republicans are pouring money into this race to help Republican incumbent Deb Fischer fend off a challenge from independent Dan Osborne. That's ruffled some feathers in the Republican Party because they're having to donate or to dedicate precious money to that race and take it away from other races. Nebraska is a ruby red Republican state. So talk about that dynamic that's causing some frustration among national Republicans.
Yeah, operatives have been talking about how this is a case of she didn't think that she'd have a tough challenger. Now in the weeks before Election Day, it's gotten tougher. The race has gotten closer. So now the Senate Leadership Fund has to put more and more funding on the Republican side into her race, which then takes away from some other Senate incumbents or people trying to unseat Democrats, on the other side. And so she is a popular senator, as you mentioned, that this is a ruby red state. This is surprisingly close, but boosting her by $3 million from the Senate Leadership Fund when that could have gone to other candidates, I think is irking some people because every seat matters so much that they thought that this one they could feel a little safer about, but so far they clearly aren't feeling very safe about it.
Republican lawmakers are mapping out their agenda for Trump's first 100 days in office, if he in fact is the winner. The hope among the GOP is that they will control the White House and Congress. If that scenario plays out, what would we expect the priorities of the Republicans in Washington to be?
Yeah, so we know that the leadership offices of the Republicans in the House and the Senate have recently been getting together and talking about, the first 100 days, what a 2025 agenda would look like. Of course, one of the first priorities is the border, putting in funding to secure the border, continue building the wall. These are all promises Trump's making on the campaign trail. We also know there have been some promises to defund parts of the federal government that Trump and other Republicans do not think work well enough, or maybe have been weaponized by the Biden administration, and then to expand and preserve those Trump tax cuts that were a huge part of his legacy last time around. They don't want the cuts to end, and if Trump wins and they have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, they can definitely hold on to those.
The Justice Department is warning Elon Musk that his $1 million giveaway could violate federal election law. Just to recap, people were eligible if they signed a Trump campaign pledge and also were registered to vote. There's a question that has been raised by legal experts as to whether or not this is actually just paying people to register to vote, which is illegal. What is the Justice Department saying, and is there really anything they could do about it at this point? Is there any scenario where they would, prosecute Musk?
Right now we know that it's just a warning. Basically, the Justice Department has sent a letter to Musk's PAC, basically saying, warning them about the law you just cited, which basically bans paying people to register to vote. I think he's, very close to that line, and the Justice Department kind of wanted to make it clear that we have our eyes on you. This is a very, you're a very prominent figure in American politics now, in American business and whatever else, global business, and, we clearly know what you're doing, and this is all in favor of Trump, so it's clearly partisan here. So I think it's more warning signs, but we'll see what comes out of it.
I can't imagine if Trump wins the race that he would have his Justice Department prosecuting Elon Musk over that issue. But before I let you go, I want to talk about some news we just got in that Beyonce is going to be campaigning in Texas, in Houston, Beyonce's hometown, with Kamala Harris. Democrats have long been the party of the celebrities, and they frequently have the star power on their side. In an election that's this tight, somebody with the star power of Beyonce campaigning with Harris, is there an advantage to that, or is this just kind of built into the Democratic Party?
Yeah, it does feel like it's built in. As you mentioned, Democrats have always been able to get these celebrities out for them. But it is an interesting strategy because this week alone we have Bruce Springsteen, Eminem, and Beyonce. So it's a wide swath of the American public who might, you don't like Beyonce, but you like Bruce Springsteen, or you resonate more with Eminem. So I think they're trying whatever they can. Obviously, the Harris campaign is aware that the polls are tightening and Trump is gaining on her. So why not bring out Beyonce to see if that could make any moves? But I do think someone like that, it's expected that she would support Harris. We know she's endorsed her. We know that Harris has been using her song at all of her rallies and in a lot of her ads. So it's kind of a matter of time of when she'd come out, and why not do it, 10 days before Election Day.
All right, Alex Gangitano, thanks so much for your insight. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Happening tonight, Republican Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance is in the critical swing state of Michigan for a town hall event with NewsNation's Chris Cuomo. It comes as Vice President Harris's lead in the blue wall states is narrowing. NewsNation's Robert Sherman is in Detroit with what to expect.
Tonight, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance will be sitting down with NewsNation's Chris Cuomo and in front of a live studio audience consisting of Republicans, Democrats, and independents to talk about the key issues that matter most to the voters, cutting through all of the noise and focusing in on those kitchen table conversations that Americans across the country are having on a day-to-day basis. And we've been on the ground here in Michigan for days on end now, talking to voters across the political spectrum about what matters most to them. This is what they had to say.
Grocery prices, insurance prices.
The border, keeping jobs here.
Supporting the UAW, supporting working class people. That is the main thing, protecting women's rights.
Michigan, our electric bill, it's crazy. I have to choose whether or not I can get groceries or I can pay my electric bill.
Those topics and more are going to be discussed here tonight, and you look at where the situation stands in Michigan right now, it is neck and neck, according to the latest Decision Desk HQ average of polls. Those 15 highly coveted electoral votes still up for grabs. And tonight's town hall with NewsNation marks one of the final opportunities that the campaigns have in order to make their pitch to voters before early voting goes live in Michigan statewide. That kicks off Saturday. Drew?
Thank you, Robert Sherman. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is pledging $135 million in aid for Palestinians and calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Blinken is currently in Doha, Qatar, meeting with officials for ceasefire negotiations. The trip marks the 11th visit Blinken has made to the Middle East since October 7, 2023.
What's so critical is that the aid gets to the people who need it. Secretary Austin and I emphasized in a letter that we wrote recently to our counterparts in Israel the imperative of Israel taking urgent and sustained action to make sure aid can get to those who need it.
Blinken's trip comes as an Israeli attack on a school on Thursday killed at least 17 Palestinians, including 7 children. Israeli Defense Forces say they were targeting Hamas militants in the building. The current death toll in Gaza has topped 42,700 people within the past year. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.